Hi everyone, I'm Travis Mannon from the Intercept, coming to you live from Columbus, Ohio, to better understand this historic yet volatile moment for LGBTQ rights in America. I'm joined by Gabriel Arkles, a senior staff attorney for the ACLU, who worked on the team that represented Amy Stevens, a transgender woman who was fired from her job because of her sex, and who was one of the plaintiffs in the historic Supreme Court decision last week. As many of you know, the Supreme Court issued a decisive victory for the queer community, ruling in a 6-3 decision that it is illegal for an employer to fire a worker based on their gender identity or sexual orientation. While the decision was a major step forward in the march for equality, the fight for LGBT civil rights is far from over. In fact, this was only the first ever transgender rights case heard by the Supreme Court. There are still significant gaps in federal discrimination protection, and it remains an especially dangerous time for trans women of color. So Gabriel, thank you very much for joining us to discuss the importance and limits of this monumental case. So let's get started off by putting this decision in a larger context. For people who may not know much about this case, what does this decision mean for those of us in the LGBTQ community?
So this case says that it is illegal under federal law for employers to discriminate against people for being lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. The Supreme Court said in no uncertain terms, if you fire somebody because they are LGBTQ or because they are transgender, you are violating federal prohibitions on discrimination because of.
Great, and so the Supreme Court ruled on Title VII, which is just one section of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that covers employment discrimination. So there are, of course, other federal laws that cover sex discrimination. Title IX of the Civil Rights Act, which covers education, the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, which protects against discrimination in healthcare. So both of these statutes have been aggressively targeted by the Trump administration, which has eliminated protection specifically for transgender people. So how does this Supreme Court decision affect Trump's ability to attack the trans community?
It really limits Trump's ability to undermine those laws. There's nothing in the decision that suggests that trans people wouldn't be covered in education, in healthcare, in housing, in credit, in any of the many contexts where discrimination because of sex is already illegal under federal law.
Cool. So it sounds like there are kind of broad implications for other federal statutes that look to Title VII as a framework for discrimination. But what does this ruling not cover? Where can LGBTQ people still face discrimination?
Well, so one thing that's important to know is just because discrimination is illegal, it doesn't mean it happen, right? So unfortunately, race discrimination, disability discrimination, religious discrimination still happens commonly in the workplace, even though it's been very clear that that's illegal for a very long time. So trans people are still vulnerable to discrimination in every context, although now we have strong and clear federal protections against it in at least some contexts. As you said, there are some areas where it's less clear. For example, or where there are just gaps in federal law. So, for example, right now, federal law doesn't have any prohibition on sex discrimination in the context of public accommodations, which are businesses that are open to the public, like restaurants, hotels, movie theaters, stores. That's something that the courts won't be able to fix, that really Congress has to go back and fix just to get. Also, while discrimination is not allowed for some federally funded programs, there are other types of federally funded programs where there are no prohibitions of discrimination. And that is another area where we need Congress to intervene if we want help. And then also, I think that, the protections against workplace discrimination don't apply to service members in the military, don't apply to people who are incarcerated. So there are a number of places where this decision won't be as directly.
Yeah, and as you said, just because discrimination is illegal doesn't simply eliminate discrimination. Just because a law is on the books doesn't mean there won't be some kind of challenges in enforcement. So, what kind of difficulties do LGBTQ people face when trying to enforce their legal rights? For example, when trying to prove discrimination or even accessing legal services in the first place.
Right. So there are a number of issues that come up for anyone who's trying to prove discrimination. As employers get more knowledgeable about the law, they start to hide their motivation, which makes it more difficult for plaintiffs to prove that what happened really was discrimination. In our client Amy Stevens' case, the employer never made any attempt to hide what he was doing. He really just fired her because he was transgender, and then just defended his decision to do that all the way up to the Supreme Court. So for people who are experiencing discrimination, it's important to keep records. It's important to try to get things on paper as much as possible, and then to find a lawyer who can help you with your case, or to go to one of the agencies like the EEOC that can pursue your claim.
And so Title VII of the Civil Rights Act carves out exemptions that allow religious institutions to discriminate in some ways. Yet in his dissent in the case, Justice Alito worried about the potential threat to religious freedoms this decision poses. So how are religious exemptions to discrimination laws affected by the Supreme Court decision? And what kind of threats to LGBTQ people are on the horizon under the guise of religious freedom?
The Supreme Court decision does not change anything about religious exemptions, but absolutely anti-LGBTQ advocates are really pushing hard on expanding religious exemptions. So right now, under Title VII, the law against workplace discrimination, employers can do have a right to discriminate if they are religious and if they are hiring you to perform a ministerial function. So that could be they're actually hiring you as clergy or to provide some sort of religious instruction. But if it's anything other than that, they do not have the power to discriminate against you under federal law. There is another case that the Supreme Court has already decided to take, which is called Fulton versus City of Philadelphia. And in that case, Philadelphia chose not to renew a contract with a faith-based organization that was providing placement services to foster youth, because that organization said that it was not willing to comply with Philadelphia's rules against discrimination. So among other things, it was not willing to place foster youth in families with foster parents. And that agency actually sued Philadelphia and said that that government has an obligation to contract with them to provide these services in a discriminatory way, because that is consistent with so we're definitely going to have to see what the Supreme Court does in that context, and whether it allows religious exemptions to somehow override particular discrimination.
And so Justice Gorsuch, the conservative Trump appointee, who somewhat surprisingly led the majority in this case, said that this opinion is just about hiring and firing. And he basically punts on the question of other issues like bathrooms and locker rooms. He mentioned those explicitly. Justice Alito called this irresponsible. And in his long-winded dissent, he points to over 100 federal statutes that ban discrimination based on sex, which is kind of funny because it essentially provides a litigation roadmap for public interest groups like the ACLU. So can you talk about some of the ongoing litigation your team is working on? What cases are coming up where you'll be relying on this opinion?
Absolutely. We have a number of cases where trans people are facing discrimination, particularly in the context of schools and in the context of health. This includes Idaho recently passed a first of its kind law banning trans women and girls in sports. So we have a lawsuit there challenging that new law under both Title IX and we also have cases like Gavin Grimm's, people might have heard of because the Supreme Court almost heard it a couple years ago. That case is still ongoing. And we've received a positive decision from the district court. We're now waiting on the intermediate court. It's possible that that case could find its way back up to the Supreme Court. We also have cases where we're in the other role, where it's actually cis people have sued school districts and other entities that are doing the right thing, and saying that that school districts actually have an obligation to discriminate. So far, we've won all of those cases, but they are still ongoing in a number of different states, Connecticut to Oregon to Wisconsin.
Great. So the last few weeks have been a very significant moment of reckoning for policing in America. Of course, law enforcement has a very ugly history of criminalizing the LGBTQ community. And as you know, the queer liberation movement was launched in response to a violent police raid at the Stonewall Gay Bar in New York City. So can you talk a bit about how, even to this day, law enforcement criminalizes and punishes people who step outside gender and sexual norms?
Absolutely. And this, the profiling of trans people is particularly pervasive and severe when it comes to trans women of color and Black gender people. So in another case that I'm working on right now, my client is a Latina transgender woman, Linda Dominguez, who was stopped for walking in a park at night. And she was a her name. She thought that she was obligated to give a dead name, and that's what she did. They pursued this legal name. They then took her to the precinct and booked her, and she claimed that she was transgender and that she had changed her name. And they then added an additional charge, accusing her of what's called false personation in New York. It's giving false information to the city simply for giving her previous name in addition to book her, which is a very direct example of criminalizing somebody simply because they are transgender. But there's also, each and every day, trans people, but especially Black trans people and trans women of color, are being stopped by police, falsely arrested for loitering for purposes of prostitution or other types of offenses, simply for existing outside. We also see really extreme violence, including sexual violence against trans people, and again, and a lot of the leaders of Black Lives Matter movements are queer women and trans women. And a lot of leaders of LGBTQ movements are Black, queer, and trans women who are fighting against police harassment and violence in their daily lives, in addition to fighting for their whole communities. And I think really, if we want to identify what's going to be most important for LGBTQ communities, I think it's going to be very much what happens with Black Lives Matter, and whether our society is willing to make some really major changes to stop the patterns of anti-Black racism and criminalization and police violence that's so deadly for so long.
Yeah, and that's a great segue to my next question, which is, even if you have formal legal equality prohibiting sex discrimination, you still have trans people of color being harassed and even murdered by the police and put in solitary confinement in prison for their protection. Anti-discrimination laws won't prevent that. So how do you see the movement for trans justice intertwined with the movement to abolish prisons and the police? And what do trans people need besides just formal legal equality?
That's a great question. And I think actually, if you want to just point people to some organizations that have been working on answering those questions, I would suggest checking out the Transgender Law Center's Trans Agenda for Liberation I would check out the trans policy agenda put together by the Trans Latina Coalition. I'd look at the policy pillars for the movement for Black Lives, and I'd look at the policy agenda of the Women's Network. Trans people have been saying for a long time that we need protection from discrimination in the workplace. And we also need a lot more than that. We need to actually be free. We need to be safe from violence. We need to have basic necessities. We need to be able to self-determine our lives and our genders. And that looks like addressing the incredible wealth disparities in this country. It looks like really creating accountability and ending the violence against trans people, especially trans women of color. That means abolishing prisons and making sure that nobody more is going to be and there are a lot of strategies that people have developed and have been developing for a very long time. The more people who support those efforts, the further along we're going to get.
Great. Well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Gabriel, for taking the time out of what I'm sure has been a very busy couple weeks for you at the ACLU.
Of course. Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you all for watching this broadcast. If you'd like to take an inside look at the work Gabriel's colleagues do at the ACLU, be sure to check out the documentary The Fight, which is distributed by our partners at Topic Studios and Magnolia Pictures. And it's coming out in theaters and on demand on July 31st. You can find a link for the trailer in the description of this YouTube video. Thanks again, everyone, and stay safe out there.